That was, of course, the opening of Disney's The Lion King, performed at the 1998 Tony Awards. That night, Julie Taymor made history as the first woman to win Best Director of a Musical. She also nabbed a Tony for her groundbreaking costume design. Since then, The Lion King has been presented in every continent except Antarctica and seen by more than 100 million people worldwide, including my triplets, who were about 6 or 7 years old at the time, waiting for the moment where they saw giraffes on the horizon. Much of Taymor's inspiration behind her acclaimed work can be traced back to her time here at Oberlin College and Conservatory. After creating her own major in mythology and folklore, Taymor traveled around the world studying various forms of cultural performance, which she credits as a catalyst for all of her endeavors. Whether it be film, opera, television, or Broadway, she is what I like to call a quintessential memory maker. She creates indelible images and experiences that last a lifetime. That's because she's willing to take risk, to do things that are unproven, and to push past established limitations, bringing us something wholly new while she forges connections across race, class, and culture, something we need now more than ever. I'm excited to talk about those early beginnings and more with one of the most imaginative and provocative artists working today. I'm Carmen Twillie Ambar, president of Oberlin College and Conservatory. Welcome to Running to the Noise, where I speak with all sorts of folks who are tackling our toughest problems and working to spark positive change around the world. Because here at Oberlin, we don't shy away from the challenging situations that threaten to divide us. We run towards them. So I'm so excited to have Julie Taymor on Running to the Noise podcast. Welcome, Julie. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
So I guess I wanted to start with, you are such a prolific creative, and I've heard you call yourself a playmaker, even though oftentimes when we think of you, we think of film and television and movies and all sorts of ways that you are into the creative space. Maybe you could help our audience understand what you mean by that when you describe yourself as a playmaker.
Well, I don't think it does encompass my film work because it is the word play.
Yeah.
But I think in opera and theater, I have been a designer, a director, a writer, a lyricist, a costume designer, set designer, puppet designer, mask designer. Because all of those things can be part of one show, like The Lion King.
Right.
Then how do you give one credit? Trying to put me into one box is a little tricky.
Yeah.
So that's why I would say a playmaker, because I could come at a play or at a production from very many vantage points and experiences.
Right. I don't know if you know David Ajay, but he's the architect who designed the African American History Museum on the Mall in DC.
I've seen that. Yeah.
And he came to Oberlin a couple of years ago, and we were sitting and listening to him talk. And about 20 minutes in, I turned to the person who was next to me and I said, "Oh, this is what a genius sounds like." As I was preparing for this conversation with you, I was talking to someone, and as I was describing you and how I think about your creative work, that same sort of phrase comes to mind. For those of us who are not geniuses, help us to understand how your creative mind works. How do you start to think about a project that can help us understand how Julie Taymor approaches her work?
Well, it depends on if the project originates from me. And I'm not work for hire. So let's make that distinction. Lion King pre-existed. It was an animated film. Disney came to me and said, we are interested in having this go on, we think, a Broadway stage, but we don't know if it can. I hadn't seen the animated film. And I was brought up on Disney like a lot of people, but aesthetically it had never been my style. I'd been in off-Broadway avant-garde theater and opera and world theater, and I had no interest in Broadway, none. And still
Really?
don't, frankly. We'll get to that
We
later.
have to talk about that. Yes.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, it's great if you can have a hit. That's wonderful. But in general, it's the material that interests me. And there can be varied places where you can make that material have meaning. When I did look at the animated film, I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was incredibly inspiring. But what got me was the challenge. I like challenge. And I love the idea of how am I going to put a stampede on stage?
Yes.
And how do I put hundreds of animals and herds and flying creatures and all of these? There's no human beings in it. The closest would be Rafiki in a way. She's a shaman baboon.
Right.
And they were very open. Disney said we don't even know what the story should be because our animated film is short and it's not complete. And they were aware of that.
Okay.
And what I really was interested in was shamanism. And I studied shamanism at Oberlin, folklore and mythology. I focused on Northwest Coast Indian culture and Inuit and the masks. A shaman in every culture exists. In South Africa, it's the Sangoma. In Indonesia, it's the Dukun. And after Oberlin, I had a MacArthur Traveling Fellowship. No, Watson Traveling Fellowship. I got the MacArthur later to Eastern Europe, Indonesia, and Japan. And
you were there for like 4 years. Wasn't this
long?
I
I intentionally went. My project was visual theater and experimental puppet theater in these places, where in Indonesia and Japan in particular, the forms of bunraku and hachoji and all of these incredible mask and theater and all are the highest forms of theater. In our culture, puppetry was children's theater.
Right.
And I hated it. Literally did not like Muppet-style puppetry.
Right.
Lamb chop and all that. I just didn't. And in Indonesia, it is by far the most respected, elevated form. So I went to Indonesia for 3 months. I was so blown away in the 3 months that I went to Indonesia that I decided to stay. I was encouraged to stay by one of their great experimental and radical and political theater directors, W.S. Rendra, to come and live in Yogyakarta in his kampung. And I did choreography there. And then he said, Julie, you stay and do your own work. We'll support you.
Wow.
So I became a director in Indonesia, in Java.
Julie, how old were you at the time when this was happening?
21 or 22. I had just finished Oberlin. And that's where, as an artist, I was born. Seriously. I mean, I've been doing theater since I was 11.
Right.
I did some theater at Oberlin. I did major theater at Oberlin. But I was also always interested in academics because you can't really do theater if you don't know literature, if you don't know religion, if you don't know the origins, anthropology.
Well, I love this because in preparation for this conversation, I looked up how many students are doing their own individual major. And there are about 20 students at Oberlin doing that now, right? Just having this space to create their own major. And I love that out of that experience came these 4 years, this piecing together all these different disciplines. I guess one thing I wanted to ask about how you would view the through line of your work. I was having this debate back and forth with folks about how would you characterize Julie's work? I said, if I was going to give you a through line, and I'm sure you probably disagree with it, it seems to me that the visual elements of all of your work have a consciousness. When I think about everything I've ever seen you do, the visual elements are so captivating.
I think our culture puts people into boxes. So you're a visual director, you're a book director, you're a this director, that director. I don't think I'm a visual director. I am a director. And with even Lion King, the story came first. That's the first thing I worked on, was the expansion of the story. And the second act was all about the prodigal son story. It's all from my folklore and mythology classes and understanding. And it was to make sure that the entire story was together and the music and then the visuals happen. You know, I embrace all forms of what can be visual, but the language starts to become extremely fundamental in the storytelling. It wasn't until Jeffrey Horowitz of Theater for a New Audience in New York offered me Shakespeare that I really, really started to be excited about the power of poetic language, not just naturalistic language, but the imagery in Shakespeare, and you've probably seen my films Titus and Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream. I've done 3 Shakespeare features. You know, it's so visual. Rome is a wilderness of tigers, and they prey on me and my own, something bastardized like that. So as an artist, as a theater maker, I hear Rome is a wilderness of tigers, and the image of the tigers, you don't necessarily want to show those images when the words are said, but they come somewhere in the play or in the film. You'll see that. You can have these extremely beautiful visual expressions from Shakespeare because he didn't have any sets in his original plays. So the visuals are done through language, but you can have the visuals in a contemporary theater environment. Just don't Mickey Mouse it, have it at the same time.
Right. How do you find the collaborative process with your other creatives? Do you find yourself bleeding over into their space in ways that are comfortable or sometimes uncomfortable? For those of us who are involved in collaborative processes, how would you describe how you approach that part of the work?
Oh, it's incredibly important. You're only as good as your tools. You're only as good as the people who you work with. And I have a lot of collaborators that I've worked with over and over. Elliot Goldenthal is my major collaborator. He's also my sweetheart. And we've been working together for 40 years. We've done films, opera, and theater together. We have a new musical that we are presently working on. It's really critical for me to hire designers who are going to go further than I would go. I mean, I could design the costumes for everything I do, but that takes me away from the concentration of the book or the directing.
Right.
And I like to have a conversation. I like to have the dialectic of discussion of what these designs. So I heavily lean into it, but I don't think I trespass their boundaries of let them do what they do. One thing about my work that you will see is it's very different looking than most other people's work because I take chances. And
Absolutely.
I take chances because I know it can be done. I may not know how to get there, but I'm willing to let those artists go further.
When you say, Julie, that you want someone who will go further, what does that look like to you if you think I want someone who's going to go further than I would?
I will be ready with concepts, and then I may not have the concept. They may come in with the concept, but I will give a lot to the designers or to anybody who's collaborating. I have to have an idea. Like, it was easy for me with The Lion King, and I'm using that because most people have seen it, or a lot of people. It's a no-brainer to go, what is the ideograph? Ideographs are when you take a story or an image and you reduce it to 3 brush strokes.
Okay.
I describe it like a Japanese brush painting. Instead of doing all the detail of the whole forest, you know, when you're painting with black ink and a brush, you do the essence of the forest. In 3 brush strokes, you create that bamboo forest. And so it's kind of poetry. It's like a haiku. You take the concept and you reduce it to 1 image. After studying the Lion King movie and listening to the music and then adding the music with La Boheme that I wanted to add, because I brought that in and made that absolutely fundamental to this new musical, was the South African composer Lebo's part in it. It was a very easy thing to find the ideograph. It's the circle. It begins with the sunrise. It begins with the circle of life.
Yes.
You will start to then look throughout the entire production and you'll see the wheels of the gazelle wheels moving. You will see the circle of water. The silk gets pulled through a hole in the floor. The silk starts to move towards that hole until it disappears. That's drought.
Right.
So you can go throughout The Lion King and see the emblem of the circle because that is the major thematic motif in The Lion King.
And that, my friends, is how a genius's mind works, helping us go further and think further. So you said something really powerful, Julie. You talked about taking risk and your willingness and desire to take risk. Do you feel like that's a part of every project you work on, or is there something that's emblematic of what you think taking risk looks like?
My motivation isn't to take risks. That's not where it starts. That just happens to be the way it is. I'm sure I repeat myself, but I don't try to repeat myself. When I did Lion King, the next thing I did was Titus, the movie with Anthony Hopkins.
Right.
I could have gone off. Spielberg offered me a film, The Cat in the Hat. And honestly, I think my response was, and remember this is 27 years ago. Yeah, if the cat is black. But I did not want to be thought of as a family children's theater puppetry.
Right.
So I went to the greatest writer in the English language at the time, which he still may be, or she may be, because we don't know who it is, but Shakespeare.
Right.
And took the nastiest, darkest play. And I'd already directed it and I loved it.
Yeah.
And got the greatest actors of the English language.
Of course.
So that's what I needed to do. So for me, it's not about I'm going to take a risk. It's just I get attracted to projects because of content. The reason I did Titus was because we were in this incredible point where the Menendez brothers had just been accused of that crime.
That's
Columbine had happened. I think the onslaught of violence that wasn't just coming from inner city, but was coming from suburbs, was coming from wealthy young people, was such a shock to the American public. And I thought that Shakespeare's play, Titus Andronicus, is the greatest dissertation ever written on violence, bar none. And even Quentin Tarantino bowed down to it when he saw a reading that we did. After I did the play, I did some readings to do the movie, and I invited some young, hip, cool, whatever you want to call them, film directors who were shocked that he did it better than they did. Really, when Shakespeare investigates violence in Titus, he talks about a good general. I remember at the time thinking of Colin Powell as Titus. What if Colin Powell comes home and they ask him to become president of the United States and he ends up baking his enemies' children into pies? Let's just think about that.
Right.
There's a movie out now called Emilia Perez, a new movie musical that may win for the Academy Award.
Right.
It's about a cartel head who wants to be a woman, and he's a monster. And yet his whole life, he wishes he were a woman, and so he does a sex change.
Okay.
Now, are we going to forgive him when he has murdered and been the head? It goes deeply into who we are born.
Right.
Are we who we want to be?
Are we shaped?
This is what Shakespeare does, is he gets to the inner monster in the good man.
Right.
And the good man in a monster. And when does that come out? For me, the story is what attracts me first. Do I think there's something to say? Is it something that I believe that I could do in a way that potentially no one has done yet?
Right.
I could do another Ring Cycle, but my God, then I'm just competing with the last director who did the Ring Cycle.
Right.
I'd rather do John Gardner's Grendel, which is what Elliot and I did at the LA Opera and at the State Theater in New York. We did the Beowulf legend from the monster's point of view, way ahead of all the time.
Julie, what do you think about Broadway?
I don't think there's much creativity on Broadway. And I don't think the producers are out there looking for it. They're scared. Money is hard. I hardly ever go, if at all. I think that a lot of great composers aren't doing musicals. They're going to be doing television or film or their own work. There are musicals I love, West Side Story. But generally, it's not my cup of tea as far as type of music. If I were to say who I'd like to hear writing songs for Broadway, or I'd love to hear Billie Eilish write a whole musical.
Interesting.
I'm sure Barbie is going to be a musical. Whether she writes it all, I don't know. But she wrote a beautiful song for that. I think Olivia Rodrigo writes incredible songs. But I really worry about just doing the musicals that exist already.
Right. You want something more creative.
I want you to create new musicals without people who are too steeped in the history of musicals.
Right.
And I really don't like calling it musicals because then there's an image to that word, musicals. Songs that you go out humming and singing. And if you see Emilia Perez, there is not one song you can come out humming and singing. But do you see the connection to Andrew Lloyd Webber or to Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story or to Queen? Yes.
Right.
Elliot and I, the composer, we could see them, but they worked together into a new fusion and way of using song and lyrics to tell a very difficult, really edgy story. Right. And it's shocking. And it may not be, again, your taste, but I think it's a great learning experience. And I would say, go put that on the stage. One of the things I like to talk about is how do you move from theater to film and how do you move from film to theater? What are the things that cross over and what are the differences that you should celebrate and amplify that theater can do that film can't do? Now, okay, this is Oberlin there. In my class on folklore and mythology, I took John Gardner's Grendel, the beautiful 1960s novel, and then I took Beowulf. My whole paper was on Beowulf in Old English with John Gardner's novel. And I compared the two, which has sort of set me out on what I do, which is I take myths and I find these stories that connect us throughout the world. I know we're all separated now, but I think the joy of being an artist is to step out of yourself. I went to Indonesia and found who I am by not being where I am.
What a beautiful imagery, Julie, that being an artist allows you to step out of yourself.
You should step into somebody else's shoes. I mean, that's the whole point. When we watch movies, and obviously African Americans have spent their whole life watching movies about white people, they understand a hell of a lot more about white people than white people do about black people, but that has changed over the years recently, and that's a great thing. But as far as who is the right, we all have right to tell stories. You just better tell it well. That's the thing. And the authenticity is authentic to you as an artist.
Yeah.
And I am older. That's what I believe. I lived in Asia for 4 years. I've been the head of the Japanese film jury for the International Festival. I've did Frida in Mexico.
That's right.
Because I was asked to do Frida.
Right.
When I go to a country, Italy for Titus, I definitely employ and work with my collaborators from that country. So as long as you're together on the journey, you all are telling that story.
It's so great to hear you say that, Julie, because you know that there's all this debate now, as you said, about who can tell the story, who has the right to tell the story. If you're not of that gender, that race, that name, the identity, do you have the right? And I what I hear you saying is that you do, from your perspective. Getting the right collaborators can allow you to tell any story you want to. Just do it with authenticity and do it with
yourself.
Authenticity
of yourself as an artist. For instance, The Lion King. And Disney gave me an album called Rhythm of the Pride Lands, which was Hans Zimmer and Lebo M's score. And I just listened to the music and Lebo singing those songs in the chorus, and I imagined where they could be in the story. And then Lebo, the musical is Elton and Lebo. Elton is not the main. He did the movie and Lebo was background, but Lebo for the live theater is the soul and spirit. Lebo's compositions and his work with chorus, South African style choral singing. It's very interesting about that because even with the unions in New York, we always have had 6 South Africans, and Rafiki has predominantly been a South African.
Yeah.
And they did not want us to bring South Africans. They were, why can't you get Black Americans? I said, because a completely different singing style. What are you talking about? Just because of skin color?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? These are Americans. These are South Africans. They're not the same people. And their singing style is the opposite. There is no vibrato. None in South African singing. There is none of the elaboration that you get in R&B. Not that there isn't in contemporary South African, but in the choral style. And with the South African team that I had, we made that point to the unions, and then they got it.
And then they allow it.
And people are making too much, again, about the color of the skin as about what the talent is, what the soul is. And
but I do hope you know, Julie, because it's come up on our campus, and I know lots of people really credit you for opening up the space and place for actors of color, Black singers and performers.
Oh, I agree with it because I remember back then, and this is really 29 years ago.
That's right.
There was no Obama. Black performers in the musical theater were always in plays about racism.
Yeah.
You could not be Black and be in a play that was you're just playing the part, except for Shakespeare. Shakespeare was one of the first where there was multicultural casting.
Yeah, kind of blind
including
casting.
Me. Yeah, I mean, that we've done, not just Othello, not just Aaron the Moor, but that really had opened up. And opera because of the great singers. I worked with Jesse Norman before I did The Lion King. I worked with the greatest opera singers in the world. But I really made the point to Disney when I did The Lion King. I knew that Matthew Broderick was Simba the voice, and for Mufasa you had
James Earl Jones.
Yeah, James Earl Jones. To white people, it didn't matter; they're just voices. But to African Americans, it did matter.
Yes.
And I said, when we do the live show, you're going to be seeing the people now. I'm only going to cast African Americans or Africans or people of color. We didn't use that expression then.
That's right. That's right.
In these major roles, except for some of the comics, and also Scar. Because I felt that having the Black brother and the white brother together, it was a turn of things. And the Borscht Belt humor of Timon and Pumbaa was perfect.
I do think that lots of people give you credit for creating these well-paid roles for Black dancers, for singers, for performers in a way that just hadn't existed on Broadway. And I think it opened doors. And I know that lots of people will say that Julie Taymor helped create that framework, and Lion King was a huge part of it.
Well, thank you. So it's been all over the world, and we almost always, not always, not in Japan because they were the second company, but we almost always bring 6 to 10 South Africans. What has happened in the last 10 years is that more voices have been heard, and that is the good part of all of this. But when you say only this person can tell that story, it's just nonsense. Because if you feel something, I mean, men have been telling women's stories for years. Are we going to tell them that they can't touch the female experience? You start to go into absurdity. K-pop is African-American music. Let's just stop right there. And we have taken and been inspired cross cultures from the beginning of time. If you want to tell me a legend of India is from India, I would beg to differ. It might have come from Turkey. It might have come from the silk trade. It's unfortunate to get locked into this thing of ownership, of storytelling. What you have to say is, do you have a reason to tell that story? Does it have meaning to you particularly? This idea of appropriation, I've been talking and hearing about it since the beginning of my career. This is very important. Techniques belong to the world. What is culture is how those stories are told, like bunraku puppetry, where 3 people in black manipulate the puppet. To do bunraku, it takes 80 years to become a master bunraku artist, and women aren't allowed. Because it's not just how to pick up a puppet and hold the sticks and move it. It's the actual gestures of that character, how the head moves, and the stories and the singing. That I would never do. To pick up and just take bunraku and plunk it down in the middle of my, no. But the technique, like Timon in The Lion King, is inspired by Hachioji puppetry in Japan. But I had a fellowship there, and I went and I studied, found, through the help of Japanese, very knowledgeable artists, I found this form where one person sits on a little box with wheels, and the feet of the puppet are attached to his feet or her feet, and they move and zoom all over the stage, and the puppet can be 3 feet tall. I went, well, that's a great technique, but I don't want the little box. I'll just attach the feet to the actor, and then have a harness that's attached, and he will be behind the puppet, making the mouth move. That's Timon. And he will be all green. He won't be all black. He will be the landscape, all green. The Japanese went nuts when they saw The Lion King because they saw their own techniques revitalized or reused in a very creative way that when you're in your own culture, you sometimes can't see its virtues the way an outsider does.
But it's interesting for new artists and young directors coming up to take that framing that you've given them, which is that, yes, take the techniques. That is the thing that you can do with abandon. Be careful about the culture piece, and you have your own boundaries, but that taking the technique is the place to start when you're thinking about other cultures that are not your own, and then telling the story from your authentic perspective is the way to balance what has become this kind of question of appropriation. That is so we want to talk about identity and where you're born and all this. I mean, I don't want to say that I'm Indonesian because I'm not technically, but where I was born as an artist was in Java. Because that's where the opportunity, where I was encouraged by Javanese performers, and where we are common as people, and this is what we're really losing right now, are common stories. The stories that transcend our differences. We have been talking a lot about our differences, and that's where appropriation reared its head again and said, you can't tell my story because you didn't live it. But most people didn't. I mean, a lot of Mexican Americans don't know what it is to be a Mexican. They have relatives. I'm Ukrainian, if you want to say. I have no connection to Ukraine, my grandparents, but I have none. But I feel much closer to Asia because I spent formative years of my life in Japan and Indonesia. And that's where I was inspired, the way the stories were told. That's where it happened for me. That's where I was born as a 20-year-old artist. And we have to be able to really open up what identity is that way. But people get stuck and bogged down. Now, if you say you have to go from where you come from, tell your stories, boy, get that over with quick.
because that's boring and dull. I say no. The reason we go to see movies and operas and theater is to get outside of ourselves, for God's sakes. We want to get out of our lives. We don't want to just stick a camera on. That's why TV is so boring half the time, because it's just sticking a camera on ourselves.
Right.
Where look at the possibilities. I mean, The Lion King is a human story. It's put in the kind of old-fashioned fairy tale guise of an animal, like Aesop's Fables or any of it. But the reason I did the double event of the mask on top of the human was because it's humans.
That's right.
First of all, we ladies know that there are no Lion Kings. They're a bunch of lazy motherfuckers who sleep all day. And right from the beginning, I'm going, all right, I guess I'm going to have to go with this idea that there is such a thing as a king lion when the women are
the lionesses are always doing all the work.
And they take care of their pride. So one of the major things I was able to do was, though, change Rafiki to a woman, to a Sangoma. And that was an incredible contribution.
Wow. Well, Julie, talk a little bit about, lots of people know you as having the distinction of being the first woman to win the Tony Award for Best Direction of a Musical. Lots of people know that is part of your sort of lineage. And I think your niece, right, became the sixth woman to win the same award. From this time when you won it to where we are right now, would you say we've made the right amount of progress for female directors? How far do we have to go in order for us to not feel like this is some unique thing? You just talked about things that you made, that you changed, I think in part because you are a female director. Give us a sense of what you would say about where we are with this part of our growth in theater.
Well, I think obviously since I was the first woman for a musical, I think that there's tremendous progress. There are a lot of female directors in England and here, and I'm assuming elsewhere.
Right.
But I think there is tremendous progress. The one thing that is very tricky for females, because I'm equally in film, is that male directors find it easier to go back and forth to big, huge commercial work, to more personal artistic work than women are allowed. And if women fail, they don't get another chance.
I was going to say the ability to fail forward is more apt to happen to men than women.
They can lose $200, $300 million on a big feature film and still do their next big feature film. I think with women, it's very hard. Catherine Bigelow, the first woman to win an Academy Award, was for The Hurt Locker. I don't see her doing a lot of work right now. And I do know that she has films. It's just for women, it's much harder to succeed to get your next project if the last thing was not a hit, whereas men fail upward a lot.
I hear women in almost every industry describe it that way, that yes, more opportunities, yes, more places and spaces for women to operate, not the same ability to not have success and still go on to the next opportunity. And that's one of the big challenges. So, Julie, you've alluded to what you're working on now. What can you tell us about it?
It's something I've worked on for many, many years in various forms. It's a story that Thomas Mann wrote, a novella, The Transposed Heads, which I did off-Broadway as a very simple dance drama years ago. Then Elliot Goldenthal and I were commissioned with Sidney Goldfarb, the writer, to create a musical, and it was for the American Music Theater Festival in Philadelphia and Lincoln Center. We were asked to write it in 2 or 3 months, and you cannot write a full-out musical. It's an Indian legend that Mann adapted, but it's not really a full legend. It's like he had 2 or 3 lines of an ancient text that he then jumped off of and placed his within an Indian legend context. The updated version of it takes place in contemporary New York, contemporary India, and then mythological, supernatural, absolutely insane, otherworldly thing. And it was way before its time, 20 years before its time. So this past year, we were asked by an English producer, do we want to do it on stage? And we said yes. We finished the script. We wrote 10 new songs. Actually, this is one of these perfect things. One of the main characters is the goddess Shakti. And she is the feminine divine. And she is She moves the story along. She transforms into all different characters in the film version, all kinds of women. She's white women, black women, Jamaican women, Indian women. She's a puddle. She's a Upper East Side snobby lady with her poodles, and she is a bag lady on the subway. Okay, so we did a reading a couple of years ago, and it was put together in 2 days, and we had an African-American excellent singer come and play Shakti. And I went, this ain't going to work. This just doesn't work. Because Shakti still, the origin is from a Hindu goddess. So this is one of these lines you have to be careful about. So during COVID, I went and did a lot of Googling. And I said, I'm going to try and find an Indian singer, a woman who can sing like Janis Joplin and act and potentially dance. And I found her in California. Her parents are from India. She's Indian, but she was brought up on hip hop.
Oh, wow.
And she's very famous right now. In India, she's like millions of
followers.
You all
and people.
should look at her. Her name is Raja Kumari. That's her stage name. She took what is classical Indian sing-speak for, I don't know what the word is, but it's for classical dancing, where you're doing the drumming in your vocal. You speak, sing the rhythms. And her African-American male friend said, you should rap it. You should do it to
It's
English.
kind of like beatboxing, rapping, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So if you go online and look at her music videos, you're going to freak out. She's got a Grammy nomination. She wrote for Ariana Grande. She finally said, I'm going to perform my own music.
Wow.
And in India, she's written top songs for big Bollywood movies. And for me, she came and she acted the goddess, and she knocked it out of the park. Killed it.
Julie, have you named it yet?
Yes.
Okay.
It's called The Grand Delusion, and its genre is a comic demonic. Now, exactly. If you don't laugh, it's not for you. I will tell you, as far as genre bending and all of that, when you say take risks, I wrote a major film script during COVID that was like my favorite project of all time. It's called White Tiger. So the story that I had created, jumping off again of an ancient myth of Korea. Most Koreans aren't as familiar with the story, but Paradigi is the story. And I absolutely loved it. And I coupled it with ideas about the extinction of animals on our planet and the white tiger being the main one for Korea.
Excellent.
And then with the future. So it's an ancient, all in my jumping off of what I did in Oberlin, Grendel to Beowulf. I took this story and I start an ancient abstract Korea kingdom, and I go right up to 2035.
Right.
Into an incredible time where the animals finally revolt. And the mythic animal comes back as the representative of the animal kingdom because she is half human, half animal, so she can communicate and warn the human beings of their imminent danger if they don't back off.
I love it.
And it's an incredible script. I've been to South America, India, Africa, Korea, Japan. So all of these experiences of mine, lived experiences, have come in to create this, my favorite story, original story, with threads that come from around the world. And I bring it to a big producer in Hollywood, and she says, it's too original.
Wow.
So I've been getting that my work is too original now for the last 2 years, because it's not evolving from IP that exists. And if you look at Dune 25 or Spider-Man 400 or everything, King Kong, you look at what is being done in the big movie spectrum, and they're all IP that pre-exists.
Yes.
That's not what I want to do. I want to bring people to places they didn't know they wanted to go.
Yes.
I don't want to bring people to places they've been and know how it's going to turn out. That's why I like to genre bend.
Yes.
I think the movies Get Out, Everything Everywhere All at Once, Parasite, and now this new one, Emilia Perez, which is a whacked out movie musical that will offend some, no doubt. But you're doing something right if not everybody loves it. There is a hunger for that in the creative, in the artistic space.
I sure hope you're right, Julie. You have certainly been an original in every way as a graduate of Oberlin. And I can't tell you how thankful I am that we get a chance to call you our own, because we see that originality all the time. Our students are obsessed with you and what you've done. And we just thank you so much for being out in the space and place, being this creative person that helps us go where we didn't know we wanted to go.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Running to the Noise, a podcast produced by Oberlin College and Conservatory. Our music is composed by Professor of Jazz Guitar Bobby Ferraza and performed by the Oberlin Sonny Rollins Jazz Ensemble, a student group created through the support of the legendary jazz musician. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and share this episode online so Obies and other folks can find us too. I'm Carmen Twillie Ambar, and I'll be back soon with more great conversations from thought leaders on and off our campus.